Welcome to the Burning Archive. Today we're saving from the flames of the Burning Archive the books of Patrick White, the only Australian to win the Nobel Prize. Why might you want to read his works today, 50 years after the prize and nearly 80 years after his first novel? That is the question on today's Burning Archive. Now, if you are an Australian of my age, you almost certainly know of Patrick White, but it might have been a little while since you read his books. Indeed, in preparing this podcast, I sort of read a bit more of Patrick White, who really I last read about 40 years ago, but he is a very important figure in Australia. He's an important figure for having won a Nobel Prize. But White is an important figure in Australian culture, Australian society, Australian history. He's an important figure for having been the only Australian winner of the Nobel Prize. But he's also important for what his writing, his novels, came to symbolise about Australian culture and society. Now, if you're listening from outside of Australia, an international audience, you should know that you may not even have heard of Patrick White, although some people say he's one of the most significant writers in English in the 20th century. And you should know that Patrick White is, to some degree, was and to some degree remains a controversial figure in Australian culture. He is not a very Australian writer, you could say. He had a very complicated relationship with this country and is very much in the great European modernist tradition of writing. In fact, the great European modernist tradition that has been so important to me as in my sort of explorations in literature. Some say he is even among the select few of the best novelists in English in the 20th century. And if you haven't heard of Patrick White before, whether in Australia or overseas, there was a film in 2012 of one of his novels, The Eye of the Storm, that was starring Charlotte Rampling and Geoffrey Rush, the famous great Australian actor, which would give you a quick, video filmic sort of insight into the nature of his books. But his star and his influence is to some degree fading in Australia, I suspect. Just looking around and doing the research for this podcast, he just does not seem to figure all that much. I haven't really seen any reflections yet on the fact that it's 50 years since Patrick White won the Nobel Prize, for example. And even though, of course, he is of lasting significance in the canon, in the Burning Archive, because he did, after all, win that Nobel Prize. He joined the immortals of literature. So why might you want to read Patrick White in 2023, 50 years after he won the prize, 80 years or so after he wrote his first novel, sort of in the midst of World War II, or on the eve and during and following World War II? The Nobel Prize Committee said that they awarded Patrick White the prize for an epic and psychological narrative art which has introduced a new continent into literature. And that is kind of true, but it also, to some degree, it is kind of true. He does represent high-end literature talking about Australia, and quite significantly so, through the 50s, 60s and 70s. But it also, to some degree, portrays something of a strong Eurocentric or Western Atlantic mindset of those members of the Swedish Academy in 1973. A new continent, really, coming into literature, perhaps even a bit of that mindset of Patrick White himself, because White had a love-hate or even an abusive relationship with his home country. He said, "It's the country of my origins that I think is what matters. In the end, whether one likes it or not, certainly I had to experience the outside world and would have felt deprived if I didn't have that behind me. But it's from the Australian earth, Australian air, that I derive my literary, my spiritual sustenance. Even at its most hateful, Australia is necessary to me. Australian earth, Australian air, but not really Australian culture or Australian people." And perhaps that is part of the mixed legacy of Patrick White within Australian cultural history. White was in many ways an exile at home. There was a book around 1980 or so about another group of Australian women writers in the 1920s and 30s by Drusilla Majeska, I think, called Exiles at Home. And in many ways that idea expresses something of Patrick White's imaginative world and his social, cultural and social, cultural, and to some degree even political significance. And I'm going to explore three aspects of Patrick White as an exile at home that give you some better, more grounded reasons to read White than the somewhat grandiose Eurocentric or Atlantocentric Nobel Prize commendation. First, his life and work really represent post-1945 Australia and its cultural elite. As it went through, Australia kind of went through its own process of cultural decolonisation. Second, his novels are superb examples of 20th century modernist European influenced literature. And that combines poetic language with mythic themes like all the great modernists. It is a form of experimentation in language that is really probably his most enduring legacy, more perhaps than some of his sort of social beliefs. And then thirdly, his novels explore the myth, the idea, the concept of the stranger, the outsider, the outcast who goes inward to search for imaginative salvation in a hostile culture, in a hostile environment. And of course, the outsider is one of the grand themes of modernist literature of the 20th century. Think Albert Camus, L'étranger, or The Stranger, or The Outsider. And Patrick White himself said, and this is the quote that sits at the start of David Marr's epic biography of Patrick White from the 1980s. Patrick White said, "I am the stranger of all time." So it was very much the way White himself identified himself, I guess, or thought of himself. And I think too, it's many ways the kind of the symbols, the texture, the metaphors and the symbolism and the stories that I absorbed when I read Patrick White as a teenager who perhaps felt also he was a stranger of all time. But that's also maybe why I haven't read him for 40 years or so. So